Good evening. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you this evening to the final session in this year's ALEPH Institute of Jewish Ideas series on Jews, Judaism, and the Pursuit of Social Justice. My name is Avinoam Pat. I'm the director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut, where I also hold the Doris and Simon Conover Chair in Judaic Studies. It's really an honor to be able to welcome you here this evening for a very special lecture with Professor Gil Troy on Zionism, Israel, and social justice. Tonight's program is the culmination of our series this year on Jews, Judaism, and the Pursuit of Social Justice from ALEPH, the Institute of Jewish Ideas. And ALEPH is a community-wide Jewish learning initiative that is supported by a generous community donor through their family fund at the Jewish Community Foundation of Greater Hartford. And ALEPH is co-sponsored by the Mandel JCC and the UConn Center for Judaic Studies. Our institute chooses an annual theme every year and invites the community to join us for high-level educational programming that connects to the annual theme. This evening's program is a culmination of this year's series, and many of you have joined us for discussions on the topic of social justice and the writings of the prophets, the history of Jews and Blacks in America, a very special session with Susanna Heschel, teaching about Jews and Judaism through the lens of social justice, and thinking about the training of future rabbis and the performing of social justice. So it's really been a robust series of events over the course of this year. If any of you have missed previous programs, all of the recordings of this year's series are loaded on the UConn Center for Judaic Studies YouTube page. So I'm really especially excited to welcome this evening's speaker, Professor Gil Troy. I will introduce him in a moment and read his bio and then hand over the screen to him. I'll just make a couple of technical comments before we begin. So our speaker will speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end of the program. I would encourage you to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to ask any and all questions which you wish to ask, and I will then moderate a discussion with Professor Troy and send the questions his way. So feel free to type questions as you have them, and then after the lecture, we'll have time for questions. So Professor Gil Troy, it's very special for us to be able to welcome him here and to take advantage of the fact that he is happens to be right now in the same time zone as we are. He is a distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill University, who currently lives in Jerusalem. And he's an award-winning American presidential historian and leading Zionist activist. In the foreword to his one of his newest books, The Zionist Ideas, Visions for the Jewish Homeland, Then, Now, and Tomorrow, Natan Sharansky writes that this magnificent work is the perfect follow-up to Arthur Hertzberg's classic, The Zionist Idea, and that Professor Troy combines, like Hertzberg, a scholar's eye and an activist's ear, demonstrating that we now live in a world of Zionist ideas with many different ways to help Israel flourish as a democratic Jewish state. Professor Troy was recently designated an Allgemeiner J100, one of the top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life. He's the author of The Age of Clinton, America and the 1990s, and 10 other books on the American presidency. One leading historian has called The Age of Clinton the best book on the man and his times. Troy has written numerous other books, including Moynihan's Moment, America's Fight Against Zionism as Racism. He has appeared as a featured commentator on CNN's popular multi-part series, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, and appeared in interviews in many other North American TV and radio networks. I could go on. We are privileged to have a very distinguished speaker join us here this evening for tonight's talk on Zionism, Israel, and social justice. Professor Gil Troy, the screen is now yours.
Thank you, Avinoam, for that warm introduction and for organizing this. Erev Tov to everybody. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to speak about this subject. As you can tell from my biography, and you can hear from my accent, I was born in New York. I taught for many years at McGill University. And about 10, 12 years ago, we went on sabbatical to Israel. And it's turned into the world's longest sabbatical. We never left. We made Aliyah. And at a certain point, my daughter said to me, she said, Abba, if Israel weren't democratic, would you be a Zionist? And I said to her, I said, it couldn't not be democratic. And I know that's a double negative and not elegant in my speaking. Because I said, the two strands in the DNA of Israel are Jewish and democratic. And by the way, of course, we know, and you've been learning this in your series, that where does democracy come from? It comes from the notion of equality, which is articulated in the Bible. It comes from the notion of searching for social justice, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, which comes from the Bible. Now, it's true, sometimes certain expressions of Judaism and certain expressions of democracy can clash. And there's going to always be a creative tension. Any country, the United States of America, Israel, the UK, Canada, any country that's based on ideas and ideals and is a democracy is not going to be like a mathematical formula. Dictatorships are very simple. They're perfectly awful. And they don't have these kind of complications. But as Democrats, lowercase d, this is not partisan tonight, we're always juggling, working through different ideas. Now, to say that Israel is a Jewish democratic state, and to say I am a Zionist, and to say that Israel and Zionism are projects committed to social justice is not to say that Israel or the United States or the UK or Canada or Australia or any country is perfect. I don't need to posit perfection. It's a foolish argument that we often make. And I often find myself suffocating from my right-wing friends and my left-wing friends. My left-wing friends are too quick to say, oh, I disagree with this one aspect of Israel, therefore I negate it all. I cancel it out. And my right-wing friends are so traumatized by that they're not willing to have any kind of criticism, any kind of self-criticism. And how does a democracy grow? How do any of us grow if we're perfect? My wife is perfect, but other than that, we're all imperfect human beings, and we create imperfect communities, and we create imperfect countries. And so I just want that to kind of be in our mind as we start the conversation, because all too often the conversation about Israel and Zionism is far too fragile. And I need a robust conversation, not just for my sake, but for Israel's sake, for the Jewish people's sake, for the sake of Zionism. Unfortunately, I have to start this evening by dedicating it to the memory of Yehuda Guta, an 19-year-old yeshiva student, Jerusalem resident, a Jerusalem neighbor of mine, who just a few days ago was murdered in a terrorist attack. And when we talk about striving for social justice, when we talk about the challenges Israel faces, we also, as a historian, I always have to put out what I call the historian's favorite text, context. That the ideals defining Israel and the reality Israel has to face are often in tension. And there's a tendency sometimes for some to only focus on the reality and others only to focus on the ideals. But context shows that we have to balance. And so I start with a little, after that dedication, and I wish his family some form of healing, some form of closure during this difficult week of Shiva for them. I play the perception game. Which Israel do you see? So sometimes, as soon as people say Israel, we think Haredim fighting, religious fighting secular, or ultra-Orthodox fighting everybody. So strange that only a week ago, so many of us united to mourn Haredim, mourn ultra-Orthodox as they died. Wouldn't it be good if we also had a little bit of tolerance of how they live? Some people just define Israel by the Arab-Israeli conflict. Others, as I said, in response, will sometimes just define it as having a gilin, blue and white flowers, and everybody dancing, or the beauty. I call it all or nothingness. I need nuance. I need the juggle. I need the tension. And I'm stealing from another colleague of mine at McGill University who says the whole conversation in the Middle East is distorted by whodunitism. We tell the story in order to decide who to blame. We tell too much of the story, either writing defense attorney's brief or the prosecuting indictment. And that's not healthy. Not to us as Jews, not to us as lowercase LD liberal Democrats, and not us as supporters or even people fascinated by the state of Israel. When we talk about Zionism as a movement for social justice, of course, we could play the love story game of where do I begin and go all the way back to Abraham when we talk about where we start Zionism. But if we talk about the formal Zionist movement, and we talk about Theodor Herzl is often stereotyped, distorted as the garrison Zionist, the traumatized Zionist, the anti-Semite. And today we have the phenomenon of the anti-Zionist. So even when we look at Theodor Herzl, in his classic statement of his vision of Zionism, der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, he finishes it by saying, we will finally be able to be free people and live in our own homes. And we shall at last live as free people in our own soil and in our own homes peacefully die. And we will create a society that's an example. David Ben-Gurion picked up on that. And he said, there's this tension. Is Israel an ark or is Israel a covenant? And he says it's both, an ark, a refuge, right? Noah's Ark. After thousands of years of homelessness, after so much persecution, the Jews needed an ark, the Jews needed a refuge, but that's not enough. An ark is passive. It's also a covenant. It's also a brit. It's also a vision of who we can be. And when David Ben-Gurion was asked in 1966, well, DBG, what do you think? Has Israel fulfilled your ideals? He gave the most wonderful answer. He said, not yet. And I love that not yetism. Not yet is saying we're still working on it. We're still trying to achieve it. And his sometimes rival, sometimes colleague, Golda Meir, went deeper into this notion of social justice and Zionism. She's the Chalutzim, the pioneers, talked about, and of course we always talk about them as secular, right? But these secular pioneers were returning to the land, were reviving the Hebrew language. The late Rabbi and teacher David Hartman said that the Zionist rebellion against religion was like the teenager rebelling against his mom and dad, who said, I'm leaving now, but never quite left. Those rebels came home. Those rebels spoke Hebrew, and those rebels knew their Bible. Moshe Dayan, David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir. They quoted the Bible. They engaged with the Bible. And so here we have the Chalutzim, the secular pioneers, speaking of Ata bachartanu, you have chosen us. What does it mean? That when Jews return to their homeland, when they alone would be responsible for their home and society, they would make a better society. This is a platform. This is a covenant. This is an opportunity. And so Jewish peoplehood, the striving for Jewish independence, wasn't just to survive. It was also to thrive. And part of thriving as Jews was to create something that would be a model, as Theodor Herzl envisioned, as David Ben-Gurion envisioned, as Golda Meir envisioned. The pioneers believed that neither a social nor a national idea was alien to Jewish thought, religion, or the vision of our prophets. Both had to be realized. And it was called, and one of the key ideas for her, of course, as a socialist, as a labor Zionist, was avodah atzmit, self-labor. They were going to work with their hands. And the third aliyah was the aliyah of the kibbutz, the aliyah of the histadrut, the national labor movement that Golda Meir was so involved with, both the kibbutz and the national labor movement. And we would drain them with our own hands. We would take responsibility. And then she gives, in a sense, a bracha, a blessing. Again, this proud secular Jew. We're driven by the memory of the past, the responsibility for the future, and by the desire to live up to a sense of chosenness, not because we're better than others. That's not what it's about, but because we dream of doing better in building a society in Israel, which will be a good society founded on concepts of justice and equality. And as I read Golda Meir, I hear echoes of her friend and her colleague, David Ben-Gurion's perhaps closest friend, who, as you can see, died in 1944 and therefore wasn't lucky enough to get a job in the state and is kind of forgotten, Beryl Katznelson. And Katznelson says something extraordinary. He says, we have two skills, two faculties, the ability to remember and the ability to forget. We need to remember. Why? Tradition, to be rooted in our past, to learn from our ancestors, to have a sense of heritage. But we cannot grow, we cannot update. When it comes to social justice, we cannot create social startup nation without also having the ability, the magic, the skill of forgetting. And so that's the tension. It's the tension in Zionism. It's the tension in Judaism. It's the tension in life. And it was very kind of Avinom to mention my book, The Zionist Ideas. One of the exciting things when I was reading those texts and putting those texts to get together, Arthur Hertzberg had 34 of the leading Zionists, all white, as they would call it, all male, all basically Eastern European, Ashkenazim. And I expanded to 168 different voices, adding in voices like Golda Meir and the poetess Rachel, adding in Mizrahi voices. And that's why we go from the Zionist idea to the Zionist ideas. And one of the things that was so exciting in putting together that anthology was understanding that these were texts not only about Zionism, not only about Judaism, but about life. Who doesn't want to sit around these days? And 20 years ago, and 40 years ago, and 100 years ago, and I'm going to predict 20 years from now, and 40 years from now, and 80 years from now, and 100 years from now, and play out that tension between memory, remembering, and forgetting innovation. And of course, the arch conservative tries to say, oh, no, we can't update. We can only remember. And the ultra-liberal only wants to update. And we want to have that balance. And that's essential to being humanity. To being human and to updating and finding innovations in humanity. Another concept that's so essential, and it's become the new N-word these days. Nationalism has become a dirty word. Nationalism for the far right has been owned by Donald Trump, has been owned, and you can love him or hate him. I'm not going to make a comment about where Donald Trump stands. But Donald Trump and the far right and the ultra-nationalists have defined nationalism in a certain way. When I put on my kippah or my kova temble, when I put on my American history mortarboard, I cannot explain the greatest successes of Israel, the greatest successes of the United States of America, the greatest successes of the UK, of Canada, of Australia, of our little club of democracies, without talking about lowercase l liberal nationalism. And so I turn to a recent book by Yuli Tamir, who in the Israeli political context is very much considered to be not on the left, but often flirting with the far left, one of the founders of Peace Now. She was an education minister in labor governments. And she makes a very important point for us today to understand. She says, and she was a student of Isaiah Berlin, we should point out, also a great liberal nationalist. She said, nationalism isn't an evil force. I always point out it's a neutral force. Think of the Jewish experience with nationalism in the 1940s. We experienced nationalism at its most horrific, at its most murderous, thanks to the Nazis. And we experienced nationalism at its most liberating for us, thanks to Zionism. 1944, 1948, big difference in our experience of nationalism. So I call it a neutral force. She says it's not just an evil force, it's not an evil force, but it's actually a good force. And she makes this really important point. As a liberal, she says, how can I explain to a millionaire or a gazillionaire why he or she should give more money in taxes without appealing to nationalism? She says, yes, I could try to appeal to our common sense of humanity. But nationalism helps us create, I love this expression, cross-class coalitions, so that citizens can share essential cultural, political, and economic goods. It's a useful tool. And we cannot, and this is from the book jacket of her recent book, Why Nationalism? She says, we cannot allow nationalism to be hijacked by the far right or diminished by the far left. And social justice is a part of that. So point number one is that Zionism and social justice, like Judaism and social justice, like Israel and social justice, are all intertwined. There's continuity, and obviously I'm rushing, and I'll be happy to ask to go into more depth. But that's an important point. And nationalism, liberal nationalism, is a vehicle for achieving social justice, and a vehicle for these kind of cross-class appeals that pull us out of our own bubble, pull us out of our own selves. So that's the first idea. Second idea is, okay, well, Israel is now not an adolescent. Israel is now over 73 years old. How you doing? In order to give Israel a bit of a social justice report card, we have to get into a deeper conversation. And again, I apologize for rushing through this, right? The real fascinating question is, what are the standards we use for determining, is a society, is a country socially just? What does that mean? So I thought I would start with a kind of seemingly objective analysis, because it has numbers and formal criteria, of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And looking at your screen, you see that in the social index of 2019, Israel is considered 30th of 41 countries. Now, on one hand, the OECD is the most advanced countries in the world. But I don't know, as someone who deeply believes in Zionism, deeply believes in Israel, I'm not so happy with the 30th place. That's not a critique of OECD necessarily. It could be a critique of Israel, right? I'm not saying anti-Semitism, whatever. But let's take a look. So what's fascinating is these are the criterion: poverty prevention, equitable education, labor market access, social inclusion and non-discrimination, intergenerational justice, and health. And here we see, and by the way, I'm very happy to share this slideshow at the end so that people can go into more depth with this. But there are reports annually, and we'll see that Israel's very interesting. Israel's one of those students that does really, really well in some and really, really poorly in others. Again, in the OECD world. Okay, so I thought we'd look a little bit, take a closer look. Now, here's one of the things that's so interesting, is that, and you're going to see here, I have a bit of a critique of the OECD analysis. It's very driven by what government can do. It's very policy driven. Okay? So, for example, we look at Israel, at poverty rate and employment rate. Well, here we see Israel, this is where Israel does well. Israel and the United States are among the most wealthy, productive societies, not just in the world today, but in human history. Equitable education, we find Israel, wow, way up there, right? That Israel does a very good job of giving almost everybody a basic, what we would call in America, in English, the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. And we know that Israel is exceptional in its nursery school education, in its preschool system. Number 5, according to the OECD. Now it starts to get a little more complicated. When we get to social inclusion and non-discrimination, I'm looking at 1, 2, 3, et cetera, turduff. I'm going down, 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 down. What's going on with Israel? We have a problem in Israel at 32. Why? Because there's a bit of a high-low dynamic going on in Israel, where we have Ruby Rivlin, the current president, for only another couple of months, gave this very important speech about the 4 tribes in Israel. He talked about the tribe of the religious Israelis, the tribe of the secular Israelis, the tribe of the ultra-Orthodox, and the tribe of the Israeli Arabs. Now, a beautiful notion from the president about all 4 of them being part of the Israeli conversation, all 4 of them being citizens. And then he added a 5th tribe, when he was criticized of diaspora Jews, but that's for a whole other lecture. But we see often that the numbers for the first two tribes I mentioned, the religious and secular Israelis, are much higher, and for the ultra-Orthodox Israelis and for the Arab Israelis, they're much lower. Is it the fault of Israel, or is it the fault of the communities? Now we're getting into some interesting questions. Because the great Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan said the essential conservative insight is that it's all about culture. The essential liberal insight is that it's all about politics. And of course, Daniel Patrick Moynihan said both have a point. When we look at public R&D spending, at research and development spending, we're going to find, of course, Israel doing pretty well, high up. When we look at family policy, also it's going to be very interesting that the OECD will find Israel sort of clumped in the middle there. And I would argue that that's because it's very much on certain governmental ideas, but that there are many other ways in which Israel is exceptional in family, but we'll be getting to that. Ecological footprint, 37 of 41. Serious problems with overcrowding, with pollution throughout the country. And not surprising, when we look at health, we're going to see that vaccination nation is number 9. And this is even before Israel's remarkable successes in the last couple of months. Of course, we know that Israel had a rocky start. And a very interesting criterion, intergenerational justice, which means, do young people feel like they get a piece of the pie? Do young people feel like they also count? And there also Israel does very, very well. So in the OECD thing, we see high and low, but I'm building a critique of the OECD thing that it's a little bit too much on the political side and not enough on the cultural side. And one of the things we see when we start looking at the culture and we look at other frameworks is, for example, one of the things I would say is, well, what's going on with education? And while we see that when we talk about a first degree, a formal degree, the ultra-Orthodox have very low numbers, but of course, if we did years of education, we would count differently, right? The ultra-Orthodox would be very, very high. When we talk about Israeli Arabs, we see the average is now about, this is women and this is men, but it averages out to, I think, about 19-20%. Israeli Arabs tend to be about 20% of the Israeli population. And here, by the way, is very interesting, is that if we look at from 2008, right, these numbers are from 2014 and the numbers now are even higher. In 2008, Israeli Arabs were at about 12-13% higher education. Now it's about 20%. We're going to be getting that in a second too. Employment rates. We see that this is what I was talking about, the first two tribes, the non-ultra-Orthodox Jews, now we're looking at Jews. And we see that there's an issue with the ultra-Orthodox, but it was much lower in the early 2000s, and now it's starting to go on the way up because there's a conversation going on in the ultra-Orthodox community and within Israel that doesn't make the headlines, that shows change. Here's something that the OECD doesn't look at all. When Israel is so defined by so many negatives in the headlines, how can it be that, and this is the ranking of happiness, the happiness ranking goes all the way down to, I think, 167 or 172 different countries, that Israel consistently ranks high? Why? My theory would be culture. And again, when we talk about family values, sorry, this slide didn't come out well. When we talk about the percentage of Israelis born into a two-person family, and that, of course, creates all kinds of questions about norms and tradition. Israel has one of the lowest percentages of children born to unmarried women, which means one of the highest percentages of born into what we traditionally considered as normative families. So those statistics, part 3, right? Part 1 was the ideal. Part 2 was the OECD analysis, which I'm arguing was a bit of a political analysis. Part 3 was trying to give some other frameworks just to get us thinking about what other criteria do I use, do you use, should we use to assess social justice? Now, part 4 is a beautiful teaching from my friend Mohammed Darwasha. Mohammed teaches and is the educational visionary at Gibat Chaviva, which is one of the most amazing places in Israel, where you often come there and you'll see religious Israelis with kippot studying Arabic, and Arabic men and women, the women in hijab, the Arabs and the Arab men in traditional garb studying Hebrew. It's a real place to try to get Israelis and Arabs working together. I'm sorry, Israeli Jews and Arab Jews, Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews working together, learning together as fellow citizens, again, with Rivlin's vision in mind. And when I sat down with him the first time, he gave me this amazing vision. He talked about the two islands. He said there are two islands in the Israeli-Arab world today. And I would argue that it's a framework that can explain things going on in the United States of America, in Israel, in most democracies. He says one island is paradise. He calls this middle-class island. He says middle-class island is where people can go to learn a profession. During this COVID crisis, we discovered, I knew this for a long time, but many Israelis discovered that about 20% of Israeli doctors are Arabs, about 25%, 28% of Israeli nurses are Arabs, and about 43% of Israeli pharmacists are Arabs. I received my first vaccination from a male Israeli Arab nurse, whom I just called a nurse. And so he says, on middle-class island, things are always better, things are always improving, and middle-class island pays into the government coffers through taxes, through productivity, through creativity. He says, unfortunately, there's another island, the island of lower class, the island of crime and grime and poverty. And that island costs the society. It costs the society in broken lives. It costs the society in the cost that the society has to pay in policing and imprisonment and in remedial care. And his vision is the more we grow middle-class island, this island, and the more we shrink this island, the better off we are. And he said, one of the things that's exciting to him in the 20, 30 years he's been active is he's seen this island, which was very, very small when he first started as an activist 30 years ago. He's in his 50s now. The Israeli Arab middle-class island 30 years ago was very, very small, and the ugly island was very, very large. He says, this is growing and growing, and this is shrinking and shrinking, and this is our task. And he would explain to me how he would do this with the most right-wing ministers of Bibi Netanyahu's most right-wing government, and use that to often get a lot of money to try to limit this island and grow this island. I think it's a brilliant analogy. Now, by now, I'm sure some of you are saying, hey, what about the Palestinians? How do you know about Israel and Zionism and social justice without talking about the elephant in the room? Especially because just a week and a half ago, Human Rights Watch came out with this 213-page report called The Threshold Cross, Israeli Authorities and the Crimes of Apartheid and Persecution. Could you think that if we're going to judge America's goodness, we have to look at its not just ecological footprint, right, but its ideological footprint, its social justice footprint, both internally and externally, and so too with Israel. But notice there are differences in the way we approach our conversation about Israel and the way we approach our conversation about America. Remember, I talked about all or nothingness and whodunitism? One friend who I really revere on many things.
Hi, Gil. I think you might be freezing for a minute. I don't know if other people are having trouble with video feed. All right, we'll just give it one minute and hopefully he will unfreeze. All right, while we are waiting for his connection to come back, it might be a good time for you. Oh. Okay, let me see. Hopefully he'll get reconnected. As long as people can hear me. It might be a good time for if people have questions that you want to ask him. I'm sure he'll get reconnected. You can start to type questions into the chat, and we'll have a minute to well, as he gets reconnected. He can we'll be able to ask him those questions, because I'm sure that that was exactly what we were waiting to hear. As he was describing the elephant in the room, the question of what about the Palestinians? So bear with us for a minute. Yeah, he's actually coming to us live from Miami, which is where he happens to be right now. All right, my apologies. Hopefully he will get reconnected. I think if you want to, if you want to ask questions, here he comes. 1 second.
Hi there, I lost you.
Okay, I'm gonna make you a co-host again, so you can
Okay.
share your screen if you'd like.
It looked like everything cut off when I was explaining my friend's
Go ahead.
critique of his response to the apartheid report. Yes. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I'm just going to share screen again. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. Right. Okay. He said, I can't dispute the finding. I can ask what the impact would be. I'm a supporter of what Israel could be, not what it is. And my response to him was, I said, I am a supporter of what Israel and the United States could be. And I sometimes support what it is and sometimes criticize. But this all or nothingism is very disturbing. There's another problem, which is having read the report, all 213 pages, there's no sense of history. There's no sense of context. There's no distinction between the experience of Israeli Arabs within the democratic state of Israel, with its challenges, the experience of Palestinians under the Palestinian Authority and Israeli control, and the experience of Gaza. Why? Because they need to clump everything together. And while they use the word apartheid over 200 times in the report, at no point did they make the case, did they prove any kind of racial dimension to Israeli policy. And so obviously it's a much longer conversation about Israel and Palestinians, but I just wanted to say that today I decided to focus mostly on the internal dynamics. I'm happy to answer questions in a minute or two about Palestinians and Israel and social justice. But just to finish, and again, I apologize for the problem there. Two thoughts. Beni Ish Shalom, who is a rabbi and from the religious Zionist community, has a beautiful idea, what he calls the theology of sovereignty. He says, for 2,000 years, the Jews were in the galut, the Jews were in exile. And much of the halakha, because you'll talk about a theology of sovereignty and a halakha of sovereignty, much of the halakha, much of Jewish law is built on the assumption of how do I survive there? He says we need a whole new conversation, a theology of sovereignty and a halakha of sovereignty about how we incorporate the Torah's ideas into our vision and into our society. And one of the things I did when I launched the Zionist Ideas was I started having Zionist salons. And when I sit and talk to either my right-wing friends or my far-left friends, I love to take this text and I say, why is it that every conversation between Meretz and Likud or Yamina or religious Zionists has to fight about the Palestinians? Why can't we say, let's put the issue about Palestinians and borders aside? And Yuli Tamir and my friends on the left believe in social justice. Anyone I know who takes the Torah seriously believes in tzedek tzedek terdaf, believes in justice. Why don't you have a conversation about what does justice mean to you? Why don't you have a conversation about where you agree and then find room to disagree? All too often, we flip. We start with the way we disagree. We start with the borders, we start with the Palestinians, and we don't get to deeper issues. And so this is a good place for me to stop the share and turn to Avinoam and ask for some questions. But to just summarize, the first idea is that Zionism, democracy, social justice, Israel, Judaism are all clumped together in a delicious mess, in a delicious synthesis. Second idea is we all have to use different criteria and ask the question of what does it mean to assess a society, a country. But implicit in it was a rejection of that friend of mine, that we do it through many dimensions. Some can go more political, some can do more cultural, but why all this all or nothingness when it comes to Israel? And the third idea is, I said my favorite text is context. Let's take that camera, that historical camera, and roll it back and say, wow, there's a lot of work left to be done. But when we think about a society that's 73 years old, when we think about a society that's made up mostly of people who came from undemocratic countries, when you think about a society that has been under the gun for so long from so many enemies, I say hats off. A lot of great miracles, a lot of great accomplishments. But has Israel fulfilled all its ideals? What did that guy David Ben-Gurion say? Not yet. And with that, I turn over to my friend Avinoam. Toda rabah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Troy. It's really an honor to have you here. And I know that there are many questions that people have related specifically to your presentation. And so I'm going to start to dive into those questions. I'll just mention that I'm very interested in sort of the social policy research that you focused on here in the presentation. And this, I don't know if you know my younger sister, Suzanne Pat Benvenisti, who happens to be the Director General of the Taub Center for Social Policy Research. So I'll have to tell her, she's gonna be very excited to hear that you were using some of their research material in your presentation. So one of the first questions that I want to get to actually comes from my colleague at UConn, Arnie Dashevsky, who goes back to sort of the founder's vision that you started with of labor Zionism, liberal Zionism. You know, if we think about sort of a Zionism that's founded on ideals of social justice or what socialism represented. So Arnie asks, what is the hope for the resurrection of the founder's vision of labor Zionism as a potent political force at a time when ultra-nationalism and ultra-orthodoxy are so dominant? And I would also add, just to piggyback on Arnie's question, that, you know, we can think about the labor movement. Certainly we can see all of these ideals that you cited, like Ben-Gurion and Baruch Katznelson and Golda Meir, sort of deeply rooted in these teachings of the prophets about social justice. But what do we make of kind of the rise of the right, the political right in Israel, and sort of these very conservative ideals of revisionist Zionism that really aren't connected to you know, those original teachings of the left and the labor Zionist movement?
So thank you for that. First of all, Arnie, I think we've met now twice virtually. So next time, ice cream in person. Look, I purposely set it up that way, right? Because I went to the core founding fathers, right? And in a longer presentation, I would have talked about 1977 and what they call the Mapecha, the revolution and the rise of Begin. But so let me say three things. Number one is that we have a tendency sometimes as American Jews and Americans to impose our left-right vision on Israel. And we assume that the left wing of in Israel, which tends to be most focused on the Palestinian, most defined by where they stand on the Palestinian issue, then also defines all kinds of things economically. And it's more of a mess in Israel. Again, a delightful mess. So when my reading of Begin, of Jabotinsky, is that they also had very strong visions of social justice. Now, their social justice vision sometimes came through a capitalist and an individualist and a lowercase L liberal approach. And so the first point is to say that it was important for me, again, in a short presentation, to start with kind of like the foundation and to see that the labor, and to make the argument that in a sense, the Labor Zionist Foundation continues to have echoes. Why? Because A, I could make the argument that Begin and Jabotinsky, I'm purposely avoiding Netanyahu, and I'll get to him in a second, had some of those ideas and then adjusted them. There's a fascinating twist which comes out in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. The Labor Party itself goes from a party of we to a party of I. Golda Meir and Shulamit Aloni have a fascinating confrontation where Shulamit Aloni gets up and starts talking about individual rights, and she says, I think, and Golda Meir, who hated Shulamit Aloni, both members of the Labor Party, goes, oh, in the Labor Party, we don't use the word I, we only use the word we. And in Israel, there's this delightful mess of collective values and individual values. And that mess now is expressed because the Labor Party became the party not just of the us, but of the I, of individual human rights. And there's an overlap with true old-fashioned revisionists having that same notion of individual rights. So that's point number one. Point number two is that Bibi Netanyahu comes from that tradition, but I've been frustrated, I could be a little political or partisan, with his refusal to follow through on that. But we now, just in the last 24 hours, have seen that he failed to put together a coalition yet again. And we might be at a moment of ultranationalism and ultra-Orthodoxy being so dominant, but we also might be at a moment where ultranationalism and ultra-Orthodoxy have reached their limits. And that leads to my final point, and again, I apologize for rushing through these, is that for all the dominance that the ultranationalists and ultra-Orthodox have had in the last 10, 20, 30 years since 1977, but really most intensely in the last 20 years, look at the press, look at the universities, look at the numbers. At no point did Benjamin Netanyahu ever get more than 26% of the electoral vote. There still is a very strong tradition of labor Zionism, of social justice, of the left. And one of the fascinating things about Israel is this constant back and forth.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I'm sure we'll get some questions about the current political moment, which I think is really fascinating to think about the possibility for the rise of a center and what that might mean to create very interesting coalitions. But we'll have to see what happens in the next few weeks. So Bob Fishman asks me, what about progressive Zionism? What happens to progressive Zionism? And I'll just add a sort of a question. Can you hear me?
Say it again. I lost your.
Yeah. So Bob asked a question about progressive Zionism, and I just want to add to that because I think one of the questions is, how do we separate out the conflict or resolving the sort of Israeli-Palestinian issue from this discussion when we talk about progressive Zionism, or we talk about, the AIPAC sort of J Street question, right? Because part of can you still hear me, Gil? Frozen again. Sorry, folks. This is our first program where we're having Wi-Fi issues. I think we made it through 6 without any technical difficulties, but now we're having Wi-Fi issues. All right, I'm going to, hopefully he'll be able to rejoin us. People can hear me, yes? Yeah. So what I'll just say to your question, Bob, is, oh, and now he's, okay. 1 second. So I think Gil got, and to somebody else's question, I think it's just, I don't think there's anything else going on. Wait, are you back, Gil? Gil, are you back? Yeah, go ahead.
So I heard the question being about progressivism and how we reconcile the progressive stand vis-a-vis the Palestinians and vis-a-vis other issues. One of the favorite lines that I have in the book, The Zionist Ideas, is quoting Ameno, I think, that says, progressive Zionism is not an oxymoron. Okay, and that's part of the reason, again, why it was so important for me to establish the progressive case at the beginning, the progressive tradition. 2 things. One is that I spent many years in Canada. Every conversation about Canada is not about the French and English linguistic issues. And I'll say, even in 2021, in the United States of America, in the era of Black Lives Matter, not every conversation about the United States should be about race. Similarly, not every conversation about Israel should be about the Palestinians. It was Yasser Arafat's ultimate conceit to make it all about him. And I think the mistake that we make is twofold. One, from the left, if the conversation is only about the Palestinians, how do you create a progressive left that can help on all these other issues that I was trying to raise? The issues of ultra-Orthodox, the issues of social equity. You can't just have a Johnny one note. You can't just have a one-horse pony. So for the sake of progressivism, the Palestinian issue cannot dominate. Having said that, there also has to be room, if we're ultimately going to have progress on the Palestinian issue, there has to be room for a progressive critique and from a right-wing and for a right-wing critique. And so I would say that even if progressive Zionism has not seen itself be, I'll use Arnie's term, has not seen itself dominate politically, electorally in the Knesset for the last 20 years, A, there still is a strong voice, and B, there's still a strong need. And what kind of social movement gives up when it doesn't succeed? You double down, you work harder. And given how deep tradition there is there's lots to work with, and there's lots to work on. Israel at its core is a very progressive society, I would argue still.
It's interesting because if we look at the past 10 years or so, when we had a strong social justice movement rising in Israel around 2011, and it seemed that there was a moment there in terms of confronting the housing crisis and food crisis and cost of living, and it seemed that there was a possibility. And one of the ironies is that the conflict can also be used by those on the right to distract from the core social justice issues that plague the society, right? That sort of the inequities that are there, to distract from resolving those issues. And if the left, if the labor movement gets too closely aligned with just the question of the peace process, it ends up distracting from resolving some of these larger social justice issues that you're pointing to. So I think it's an interesting dynamic.
There are 2 races that I love right now between the United States and Israel. One is that there's a competition between Israel and the United States as to which country devotes a higher percentage of its GNP to civil society. Israel and the United States are the two leaders in the world. And the second is, I think, that both Israel and the United States are trying to figure out, how do we create a high-tech society, a high-tech economy that also establishes a middle class? And I would argue that Israel is a half step ahead, but we need proper leadership to be 5 steps ahead of where the United States is.
Yeah, great. Okay, a couple more questions have come in, so we'll try to get to a few of these. So Gary asks about the Haredim. How do you reconcile the Jewish societal divide with the Haredim having their own educational system, large families, voting in blocks, generally poor families, with the rest of secular Israelis? And I think, as he's also alluding to, right, that in some cases, this is a sign where political, maybe disproportionate political power does not necessarily meet the needs of the community itself, right, in terms of the high poverty levels, and really meeting the needs of the community. And some of the criticism of the disaster that happened in Meron is that this is a case where, government enforcement of protecting large population, right, by imposing safety standards that should be, right, that too much power for the Haredi parties might have ended up endangering lives by not imposing those sort of safety mechanisms. But to his question, right, how would this be? And I want to add to it about how do you reconcile the social divide with Haredim and the rest of secular Israelis with asking a question about Yair Lapid also, because this could be a very interesting moment of sort of, a rise of the secular middle, perhaps. So what do you see as potentially happening in that regard?
So my first mischievous response is that when I see large groups of Haredim protesting and voting, I call that democracy, right? We tend not to call that democracy because the outcomes are certainly not what some of us might on this phone call might want. But I, first of all, acknowledge that they're exercising their democratic rights, and B, they have gamed the system. C, one of the things that Natan Sharansky always points out is that there has never been an Israeli government, not from the right, not from the left, that didn't give in to the Haredim. And 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, we might be able to change that sentence. But this has been a problem that's systemic. That's number one. Now, you're right. It's interesting that from our perspective of what the Haredim need and their perspective, or certainly the political perspective, the Haredi politicians' perspective might be different. But one of the challenges is, and one of the failures, I think, of the government in the last 10, 15, 20 years is they've allowed the Haredim not only to create their own education system, but also to create their own rules. One of the things I think that we're seeing now in the last year, it's not only Meron, but also one of the things that was going on in COVID was how could there be, and it's funny, in Israel, we often talk about it being in the past tense, which is quite liberating. The crisis continues, of course, but how could it be that the Haredim follow the rules of their own? So we need electoral reform, we need leadership, and we need a conversation with Haredim in which we start saying, hey, wait a minute, maybe there are other things going on. But I actually tend to be optimistic on this because, and I love a lot of the Taub Center's work, but sometimes they're a little bit pessimistic. And I tend to be a bit of an optimist because you know what happens? You're born into the Haredi system and it's very easy to check. When you drift away, there's no exit. And so a Haredi is still considered to have 10 Haredi children when 2 of them or 3 of them or 4 of them might have gone secular or national religious or datlash. There are all this whole phenomenon. Again, because of time, I'm compressing. But look at how many Israeli cultural phenomena. I'm not talking about shtisel, but I'm talking about articles, books. There was a television series about Haredim on the run, about Haredim, a halfway house for ex-Haredim. You go to almost any simcha, any affair in Israel. Well, my mother used to call it an affair, right? Where you go a wedding, a bar mitzvah. Remember those things that we used to do before COVID? Now we're doing. I was at a 300-person wedding. You almost always, if you're at a Haredi one, you see secular people there. If you're at a secular one, you see Haredi people there. Why? Because there's a drift in and a drift out. So we only count them being born and growing, but we don't see why are they so afraid. Why are they so afraid of these little things called smartphones? Because they see the handwriting on the wall. They know what my great-grandfather looked like and what I look like today. So there are also indications that there are shifts going in that direction. They're not just winning every battle. But we need leadership to create a real, and this was one of, again, going back to Ruby Rivlin's beautiful metaphor of the 4 tribes. The 4 tribes have to be able to be tribal. What Rivlin was saying, I want to respect the cultural, again, going to the Moynihan idea too. I want to respect the cultural integrity of ultra-Orthodox, the cultural integrity of Arabs, the cultural integrity of religious, the cultural integrity of secular. But I also need certain basics, a certain common vocabulary, certain common connections, a certain common platform. One of the things I advocate for frequently is national service for Israeli Arabs, for Haredim, for all. Do it in your own communities, right? I would start in the Haredi community, put Haredim in the Haredi community, Israeli Arabs in the Israeli Arab community. First start exercising that muscle when you're 18 of giving back. And then eventually do as the other two tribes are forced to do and are often privileged to do, national service for all.
Thank you. All right, I think we'll do one more question, okay, and then we'll wrap up. So this question actually comes in from my father, Yehuda Pat. So he asks or comments that the fact that an Arab member of Knesset is likely to support a government of either Lapid or Bibi is a sign of hope, in my opinion. And this is a reference, first of all, to Mansour Abbas and sort of this, term of being the kingmaker, right? There's always multiple kingmakers,
Right.
but the idea of the one who can put the coalition over the top. And so what do you make of this, both on his end? I think sort of the, taking basically a 4-seat party and saying we're going to put ourselves in the middle of the Israeli political system to try to resolve some of the social crises that are plaguing the Israeli Arab communities right now in terms of crime, in terms of poverty, and saying let's work within the system and try to use our political power to get our needs addressed. So what do you think this signifies, and what are the, do you see this in an equally hopeful way in terms of what this might mean for the future of engagement with this part of the Israeli population?
There's bad news, there's good news, and there's unclear news. The bad news is that the system is very problematic. If this coalition pulls together, and if, let's say, it's a Bennett government, you're going to have Bennett as prime minister with 7 votes, backed up by Yair Lapid with 17 votes, and then ultimately Abbas's party with 4 votes, right? And so what does that mean? That means that and if it's going to be 61, it means that every single person in that coalition has veto power. There are fundamentals in the system that need to be fixed so that this notion of this constant blackmailing and this constant disproportionate power of certain key players, of you call them kingmakers, ends. That's the bad news. The good news is, what does Abbas signify? Whether he succeeds or fails, there's a new conversation going on among Israeli Arab politicians. A friend of mine who works very closely with that sector, you'll see has to remain off the record for this, says that when he works with Israeli Arab mayors who graduated from Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, Haifa University in the humanities, in anthropology and sociology and history, it's often a disaster because they're extremely ideological. He says when he works with mayors who are scientists, or in Abbas's case, dentists or doctors, it's magic. Why? Because they're pragmatic. If I read, and when I have read, the mandate of Abbas's Islamist party, it's horrifying. But when I hear his words, I believe him that he understands that ultimately it's about pragmatism. It's ultimately about living together. We need more pragmatism and less ideology in the society and among the among the leaders, and especially among the Israeli Arabs. The Israeli Arab ideologues have been ill-serving their community for decades. And Abbas could be the symbol of a new start, a more pragmatic sign. And the question is, will it work? So Golda Meir said, you can't be a Zionist and a pessimist. So I'm always an optimist. I'm optimistic that this current mess will actually stumble forward and will fail up. I'm optimistic that the vaccination nation will continue to build on its extraordinary healthcare system and lead the world out of COVID. And I'm optimistic that ultimately, you know how in the driving test, what's the driving test? The driving test is, are you competent? But also, do you know your directional signals? Take any one of these issues we've talked about and ask yourself, would you rather be an Israeli Arab, an ultra-Orthodox Israeli, an Israeli secular Jew, an Israeli religious Jew, one of the 4 tribes, in 2021, 1981, 1961, 1948. The directional signals are positive. We're going in the right direction. Are we perfect? Certainly not. Do we need all kinds of creativity and vision to make us better? Absolutely. But again, when I pull back, do I think that on the whole, the society is far more healthy than most people give it credit for? The chances of peace are much higher than most people give credit for. And the real sense of that middle-class island, not just for Israeli Arabs, but for others, growing and growing, and the ugly island shrinking, that's my vision, that's my hope. And I appreciate all your intelligent comments and challenges, and all the work you did, Abinoam, to organize it. So Dad, you should be very proud of him. Thank you.
Good. Well, Gil, thank you so much. It's great to end with a note of tikva, a note of hope. I think that is a very appropriate way to end. So if I can invite everyone to join me in a virtual round of applause, as has become the tradition by now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us here in West Hartford or in Greater Hartford virtually this evening. We wish you safe travels and much continued success in your work. And thank you to everyone for being with us this evening. Everybody be well, stay healthy, stay safe, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone.